Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host Dr. Reid Robison and I are joined for the third time on the podcast by Dr. Paul Thielking. Paul is a psychiatrist, palliative care physician, Zen practitioner, and the chief scientific officer here at Novamind. Paul joins us today to talk about psychedelic clinical trials. This is something really cool that we get to do here at Novamind at a branch of our organization called Cedar Clinical Research. We talk about the exciting and challenging aspects of conducting clinical trials on psychedelic medicines, the unique challenges that adding psychotherapy to these trials presents. We talk a little bit about the future of treatment, what actual psychedelic-assisted therapy treatment might look like once that treatment escapes the clinical trial world and makes it to an office near you. We discuss how difficult it might be to get enough therapists or guides or facilitators trained to meet the demand and some possible solutions to that problem. If you're watching on YouTube, please drop a comment below. Like and subscribe to the video. I'm sure you're sick of hearing that phrase, but please, it's called a call to action. So I'm calling you to act. Please like, subscribe, comment. If you're listening on a podcast app like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you have the delightful opportunity to leave us up to a 5-star review. We'd be honored if you did. That lets the mechanized gremlins pulling the levers of our attention these days, lets them know that this show is worth watching, and they might present it to more people who might find it beneficial. You can find myself and Reid on Instagram. I am at Dr. Steve Thayer. Reid is at Innerspace Doctor. We forgot to mention on the podcast, if you're interested in the clinical trial work that we're doing, interested in maybe even participating in a clinical trial, you can go to cedarclinicalresearch.com. Without further delay, I bring you Dr. Paul Thielking. Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, and today we are joined by the intrepid Dr. Paul Thielking. Paul, this is your at least second, if not, I know. I looked into a thesaurus before we started today.
Oh.
This is at least your second time, if not third time on the podcast.
I think it's my, to tell you the truth, I can't remember if it's my second or third because I talk to you guys a lot, but I think it's my third.
We'll call it
I think
third.
it's my third.
So just for the folks who are maybe new to our show, why don't you introduce yourself, your role here at Novamind Cedar? Yeah,
sure. Well, thanks for having me back. It is a pleasure to chat with you guys on the podcast again. So I'm a psychiatrist. My name is Paul Thielking. I'm also a palliative care physician. I came on board, joined Novamind June of 2021. So it's been about 9 months now or so, and I'm the chief scientific officer and involved in some of the clinical trials we've got going on, some of them in psychedelic medicine treatments.
Yeah, which is what we wanted to talk about today. So for a little color context for our listeners, Paul, Reid, and myself just returned from an Investigator meeting in Chicago with a company called MindMed, where we were talking about a psychedelic clinical trial that we are going to be doing. MindMed is the sponsor. Is that the term that we use for this? Okay. So we just thought it might be interesting for our listeners who are really interested in psychedelic-assisted therapy, but the science side of it. How do these medicines that were illegal for so long and villainized and vilified, how are they brought back to the public through normal scientific and government-sponsored or approved pathways and avenues? And one of those ways, if not the only way, is clinical trials. And that's one of the many things that we do at Novamind. We have it's called Cedar Clinical Research, which is right now basically Paul's baby, although Reid's very much involved. So yeah, we thought it might be a good time to talk about psychedelic clinical trials generally, and then some of the stuff that we're getting up to here at Cedar Clinical Research.
Let's do it.
Where shall we begin?
Well, maybe we'll just begin with a broad overview. That's the word I'm looking for.
What the heck is a clinical trial?
What's a clinical trial?
Yeah.
Paul, you want to talk to us a little bit about what a clinical trial is?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. It is a big topic, but in general, when drugs of any sort, could be psychedelic or otherwise, are going through the regulatory process of getting approval by the FDA to come to the marketplace, they have to go through a series of steps to be evaluated in a scientific and careful way to make sure, number one, that they're safe, and number two, that they're effective and they do what they're supposed to do. And so a clinical trial is one part of that process where it's basically a scientific experiment where you evaluate to see whether the drug is safe and whether it's effective. Mm-hmm. And there are various types of clinical trials. There's different steps along the pathway. And here at Cedar Clinical Research, that's one of the things we have expertise in, is helping pharmaceutical companies run these clinical trials that they need to bring their drugs to market.
So people who are excited about psychedelic medicine have been following MAPS probably for a long time, and they've heard data coming out of what they call phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. You talked about steps, Paul. What are the phases that they're talking about in a clinical trial? What does that mean? Either one of you can take it.
I'll lead it off, and then I'll let Reid chime in if he'd like to. But in general, like if you've got a new drug that you want to research and bring to market, first thing you need to do is you need to learn about how the drug acts in the body. And so you have to do like basic research. A lot of those studies are in animals to start with. You get basic information about safety and just how drug affects the body. And then eventually, if you get through those early phase studies, typically called like phase 1 or those early phase studies, then you can get into small groups of humans, human beings, and you can start doing pilot and small phase 2 trials where you start looking at the drugs in small groups of people, and you start looking to see not just about safety, but also, does the drug is it effective? Does it do what you want it to do or you think it can do? And then if you get through that stage, then you get into later phase 2 and then phase 3 trials, which are larger groups of people where you're really trying to see across greater populations, like, does this really pan out? Is this really an effective drug and a safe drug when you start giving it to larger groups of people, like not just a handful, but maybe hundreds, or even thousands. So that's when you get into phase 2, phase 3. And then eventually, if you have successful phase 3 studies in hundreds of people, then you can get FDA approval. And it's a long process. It takes years, if not decades, as I think MAPS has found with MDMA. And but it's a process, and it's kind of a clear pathway towards getting psychedelic drugs approved for some kind of use in the future.
Mm-hmm. So to recap, preclinical animal studies, mice often. Phase 1, first in human for safety. Phase 2, does it work? Phase 3, bigger, maybe multiple populations, multiple studies addressing the same indication. Does it really work? And then phase 4 you hear about, which is post-marketing. What else do we need to know? Like, are there other rare events that we didn't catch in clinical trials? Or how does it go in the real world?
So not only does this take a long time, it's also very expensive.
So it takes, on average, for a CNS drug, about 8 years to bring a drug to market through all those phases, and $500 million to well over $1 billion in drug development cost.
Yeah, I wanted to underscore that for our listeners, just because it's sort of mind melting when you think about the time frame and those numbers, the dollar numbers. How much needs to go into bringing a drug like this to the public? And there's probably a lot of thoughts and opinions about why it takes that much time and why it costs that much money. But one of them is just safety, right? If the FDA is going to approve a medicine, they want to make sure that it's efficacious and that it's safe.
Yeah, clinical trials are no joke. Like, there's a lot of infrastructure needed, a lot of team members working on it at all these levels. You have your sponsor, like you were saying, Steve, which is essentially the drug company, the pharmaceutical or biotech or drug development company. And then there's often a CRO, a contract research organization, that is managing the study for them. Sometimes the sponsor will do it themselves, like MAPS is doing. And then you have the clinical trial sites. A phase 1 might be done at one site, but the other ones are going to be done at many. And they start to become really expensive because you're also paying the participants a reasonable amount for their time and travel, and you have to pay for all the skilled researchers working on it. And psychedelic studies, of course, take longer than more infrastructure and time in office than just sending people home with a pill.
Which might be a good segue into talking about psychedelic clinical trials and the unique challenges of psychedelic clinical trials. So not only, like you alluded to, Reid, are people coming into office and taking something like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA, which is different than a take two of these, call me in the morning type of approach to pain or psychiatric illness. They have to be monitored, but we're not, and the trips take a long time, right? So, psilocybin, 4 to 6 hours, MDMA, 8 to 10 hours, LSD, 8 to 12 hours. Like, this is a long time that people are going through these experiences. But most of these companies, we're not just testing whether or not the drug or the compound or the molecule is going to be helpful. We're testing it in conjunction with support, guidance, or in some cases, psychotherapy, right?
Yeah.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is the name of the podcast. So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. We can get into the details here, but that's one of the big challenges.
It is a challenge because the FDA traditionally just approves drugs, but now with MDMA moving in a really positive way through the phases of drug development, they're going to be faced with this challenge of approving MDMA-assisted psychotherapy or reviewing it for potential approval. And that's a paradigm shift in mental health and the FDA approval process.
Which is in part why we don't really know what it's going to look like. Right, we were at Horizons, another conference on psychedelic medicine in New York, which we did a recap episode on, if you want to look back in our catalog. But there we heard MAPS talk about the timeline, talk about the challenges of bringing MDMA to market. And this challenge that Reid just talked about of the FDA approves the medicine, but they don't have any sort of regulatory power over psychotherapy. So it might say in the REMS, we can talk about what REMS means, that this drug needs to be administered in the context of a supportive therapeutic relationship or something like that. But I don't imagine they can say much more, right? They can't say, you must do IFS with this particular therapy, or this is the protocol that involves these 10 steps, or this manualized therapy treatment.
Yeah, it complicates the picture drastically, because the model that's emerged, not just with MDMA, but psilocybin, LSD, and probably others to come, is that there's heavy psychological support in the sense that you've got two therapists in the room with the person who's receiving the medicine on their dosing day. And it's a huge investment in therapist time and resources. It creates a huge bottleneck in terms of how do you train therapists, or a question about like what kind of training does a person need to be in that role. And it all remains to be seen how that plays out if and when FDA approves any of these medicines. Like, how does the therapeutic component factor into the regulations, and if it is required, like who monitors that, who's in charge of making sure that process is followed like it's supposed to be, like in terms of therapy. Like, we just have a lot of unanswered questions. Like, nobody really knows for sure how this is all gonna play out.
Yeah, I mean, we have our guesses from past approvals that don't have that level of therapy, but may have a similar thing like the REMS system that you just mentioned, like Spravato is a good example. One of the more recent CNS drug approvals, because it came with it this tight regulatory requirement to register every clinic and clinician who gives it, the pharmacies who dispense it, and even the patients, so they can really track safety and abuse potential of it after it was approved.
And that's what a REMS is, right? It's the regulations for administering the drug.
Risk Evaluation Management System. So there's a REMS for Accutane that says you need to get, like, if you're a female, you need to get a pregnancy test and show proof of a negative one before you can fill another prescription, for example. And in Spravato, it helps make sure that the S-ketamine is only being given in clinic by certified professionals who then observe the patient, self-administer, and things like that.
Right. And so part of that is you have this empirical study conducted under tight constraints because we're trying to exclude confounding variables and isolate the dependent, independent variables.
You might need to define some of those.
Oh, yeah. Well, we just want to make sure that what we're doing is actually what's helping. And we wanted to make sure we exclude anything that we're not keeping track of that could affect the outcome. So when you're doing psychotherapy outcome research or drug development outcome research, you want to make sure you have a nice, as clear as possible connection to what you're doing or what you're giving and the outcomes that you're seeing. It's impossible to control for all variables. So we have all these statistical analyses that try to rule out confounds or at least control for them.
Yeah.
But if we're studying the drug in relation to a therapeutic approach, or at least a space-holding approach, what's it going to look like? So we make all these conclusions about how helpful it is based on that data, based on that research. And then when it goes out into the world, it's probably going to be used differently than it's used in the clinical trial space. And so can we make the same claims like LSD gets approved for LSD-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety, and then I set up shop as an LSD-assisted psychotherapist, but I use EMDR with LSD, but it's never been studied with EMDR.
Yeah.
So these are kind of the Wild West side of it that maybe it's off-label.
Well, the REMS will control, assuming a REMS is in place for every psychedelic we can anticipate in the foreseeable future, which I think there will be, right? Like even Spravato had a REMS. That means you have to have treatment-resistant depression, or the other indication now for Spravato is MDD with suicidality. So you have to have one of those two, or you can't get it. Someone could still pair it with the MDR, that's a good example, but they couldn't give it to someone who doesn't have depression. The studies may have excluded OCD alongside your depression, but in the real world, you could give it to someone with depression and OCD. So there are all kinds of new areas like that pop up in the real world, but it still does limit the off-label use.
Yeah. As the therapist, I'm just really interested in the therapy variable, because I think we looked at the Yale manual for psilocybin-assisted therapy, and it's very non-directive, very common factors focused. MAPS manual for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is pretty similar. Yeah,
non-directive.
It's non-directive. I mean, it's got there's some influences in there.
Yeah.
Like you can see the psychoanalytic influences, you can see the parts and transpersonal influences.
Yeah.
And I think they even spell out a list of types of therapeutic modalities or interventions you can offer as part of that kind of gestalt of therapy as part of the MDMA session.
Yeah. That's a future big thing that needs to be explored, is like the different kind of psychotherapies or the specific factors in the therapies paired to the medicines. But I think first step is get them approved and keeping the therapies as not simple, but as controlled as possible so it can be replicated. Because like MAPS looked at that. They looked at did the MDMA response rate differ wildly between sites, and it wasn't, thankfully. But how about among therapy dyads? That hasn't been really shared yet.
That's super interesting to me, because when you look at the psychotherapy outcome research, it's just a lot squirrelier than I would think than just, take the Prozac, control for other variables, and see if Prozac helps. Because there's so many things that go into influencing the outcomes for psychotherapy. And some of it's the skill of the therapist. A lot of it's these common factors, like how friendly are you? How warm are you? How good of a listener are you? Common meaning common to any kind of psychotherapy that you would deploy to help
without
somebody.
MDMA on board, all those things. So it is new territory too when you have an empathogen in the mix.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you're mixing in all these things. You're bringing with, so when you're adding psychotherapy to these studies, you're bringing with the psychotherapy all the things that make therapy hard to study in and of itself. You know, we have therapies that have strong empirical support, in part because they just lend themselves really well to empirical research, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. It's when done strictly, it's a manualized treatment. You know, you give these particular responses, you give these particular scripts, you follow these particular session protocols, which makes it easier to study, easier than something like somatic experiencing or,
Parts work.
Yeah.
Because what parts are going to show up, right?
Yeah.
But the nice thing about psychedelic medicine studies is that I think some of the confounding variables become less relevant because we're seeing more rapid changes and more rapid responses than a traditional antidepressant that might take 6 weeks to kick in. There are a lot of variables that can show up in 6 weeks. So at least we have this time window. Even ketamine takes some of that out of the equation, where you don't have as many potential things that might creep in. So it is like Stan Grof said in that quote of psychedelics are to the mind like the telescope is to the astronomer, for example, because it is shining a light on things that we couldn't previously study because it just wasn't possible to observe it. There's too much else going on.
Right. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, there's just a lot we don't know about therapy and how important it is to pair with psychedelics. Like, I think a lot of maybe people in the field have a sense that it's important to have a skilled therapist in the room to handle certain situations that might emerge or that have that background, but we don't know. Right. Maybe all you need is a friendly, warm, person who's not going to bolt, if things get a little wild or strange in the room, that just is there with you and maintaining a supportive presence. Maybe that is enough,
That's a good point.
And do you need 2 people in the room? Do you need 1 person in the room? Or, as we're kind of curious about, like, can you do this in groups where maybe you've got 1 or 2 therapists for a group of people, right? So there's a lot of just unclear answers about the role of the psychotherapy component. And I think a lot of the studies, I mean, we don't know the details of a lot of the studies coming down the pipeline, but my guess is that the therapeutic component is going to become just more simple and basic, as these studies come further along through the clinical trials process, just to eliminate that confounding variable, and also just to try to understand that question, like, how important is it to do therapy, right? When somebody, or maybe you just are present, and let them have their experience.
Yeah, and I think it's good that we're seeing that already, and it's good it's happening. And I do think there will be a follow-on frontier to that whenever it really starts to pick up steam of exploring the different combinations of different therapies with these medicines, kind of like we're doing with ketamine now.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. I mean, we grapple with that already with discussions about ketamine and, well, how important is it to have a therapist with you facilitating your ketamine experience or processing your ketamine experience. For some people, that might be really important. For other people, they might not really want that or even need that.
Right. And like you said, we don't know. I wonder if that might be a function of how distressed or how quote unquote sick somebody is. It probably wouldn't always be. We hear case reports of people who are really not doing well and they have one psychedelic experience, sometimes even on their own, and it's transformative. But yeah, we talk a lot about integration when we've talked about the way we do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for our clients, and that's code for lots of help after your psychedelic experience, right?
Which most people don't engage that kind of support after. And I think while we hear stories of spontaneous healing from a psychedelic experience in the mountains or at a rave or a concert, we hear many more stories than that of people having an experience, positive or frightening, but things snapping back into place eventually. They might be changed, transformed somewhat, or have a different perspective. When we're talking about mental health conditions, I think there's a lot to be said about the preparation and what happens next.
Yeah, I mean, because you hear plenty of stories about people having really negative or even traumatic experiences when they're not prepared or they don't have that integrative support afterwards.
Yeah, spend 5 minutes on the Psychonaut subreddit, or the therapeutic ketamine subreddit. There's a lot of, I like Reddit, but there's a lot of subreddits dedicated to different psychedelic experiences. And people report being very distressed and disturbed, and they're often asking, what's next? How do I make sense of this? So we're in the business of figuring out how to do this clinically and are making some assumptions, and then we're doing our best to test those assumptions, at least some of them, in the context of a clinical trial.
Yeah, and in the context of a clinical trial, you're really controlling, like you were saying earlier, you're controlling as many variables as possible, and up to now, at least, there's a lot of prep support, integration support, and support in the room during a dosing day that's part of these clinical trials.
Well, and you were alluding to earlier, Paul, that's a lot of resources.
It is, yeah.
I mean, for the psilocybin clinical trial we're doing right now, not only are there 2 people present for the dosing day, the whole 7-hour, 8-hour day, we're present, I just did this morning, we're present for all the preparation integration sessions too, both of us, both of the therapists.
Yeah. And in the MDMA studies for PTSD, it's 40 plus hours of psychotherapy paired with the 2 dosing sessions.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's not just the number of hours. So for this example you're giving, Steve, let's say you're doing 20 hours of therapy work over the course of a couple weeks, and the other therapist is, the hours add up quickly, but it's also your normal schedule as a therapist is not to do an 8-hour session with every person you see. It's to do 8 1-hour sessions during a day. So, you're blocking out now a whole day with one person, right? And so it gets logistically very challenging to run these sessions, right? And to figure out how it fits in with your regular work routine as a therapist.
Well, we've talked a lot about this just internally, but MAPS is getting these questions a lot right now. The questions of how does this get translated into the quote unquote real world? And how does it become accessible and affordable?
At least they're being proactive about it and have done now 2 cost effectiveness analyses or published studies.
Well, the one they just came out with was promising, right?
Yeah, so was the original one. It showed that even at an expensive cost, given the infrastructure required, the time, the space, the medicine, it was still hands down, a more effective and cost-effective approach for severe PTSD.
But even so, it's going to require, it's one thing to run a clinical trial, right, where you can pay people and bring them in to be the therapist on the study. It's another thing to figure out how does this get integrated into regular mental health care, right? Because it doesn't fit the models, the clinical models we've got now.
A much bigger challenge, but in some ways similar to what we experienced with Spravato when it came out, or when we made the decision to give ketamine. Spravato was also a paradigm shift of coming in to stay for the required 2 hours, twice a week for the first month, once a week for the next month, and etc. And having the space for that in clinic, having this expensive drug cost too that insurances have to kind of wrestle with. And so we've been navigating all that for a few years now, and it gives us at least some practice and a glimpse of what lies ahead, but the magnitude of the challenge is so much bigger. ahead of us with these psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies.
Yeah, one of those challenges we often talk about is training.
Yeah.
Training new clinicians, and MAPS is trying to tackle this too. But if the specific approach, maybe it's not a particular psychotherapy approach like we're talking about, but there's still some training that has to happen, especially for therapists who have no experience with non-ordinary states of consciousness, or guiding or helping people in those non-ordinary states. They're going to need some training and likely some certification, right? And for MDMA at least, is MAPS going to be the bottleneck? Are they going to be the only ones, since they're going to be the only ones who can distribute the medicine, it looks like?
Well, they did say that their lofty goal is 30,000 therapists trained by 2030.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think that, my guess is, you can tell me if you know better, either one of you, that's not going to be 30,000 therapists trained by MAPS.
Well, in partnership, I would imagine, and MAPS is very collaborative, you know, has a great kind of partnering spirit out there in the field. So that's what I would guess as well. But they're training people now.
Yeah. But they do have a very specific training format and method that I'm guessing will continue, and whoever they may partner with.
Yeah.
You know, it's gonna, like, they're gonna
set sponsored.
They're gonna maintain the standard for MAPS for MDMA assisted therapy training. But the next wave after that will likely be medicines like psilocybin, maybe LSD, others, where it's not just one company or one group that's controlling the training, right? And that opens up all other kinds of questions, because you can find lots of psychedelic training programs out there nowadays. You can get a certificate. You know, I have one from probably the gold standard, the CIIS program. Right? Yeah. But I don't know for sure what that's going to mean to the FDA in a few years, or the DEA. Like, they might not care if I have that or not. I don't know.
Yeah, so far, nothing other than it. As part of that, you got most of the MAPS training done, and CIIS is the longest standing, and many argue the most well-established, rigorous so far. But there is this trend towards more psychedelic training in med schools, residency programs, etc. And then there are also the other fields to draw from. Like, look at what just happened in Utah over the past few years with medical cannabis, just as an example. So medical cannabis gets approved. This is a state initiative, right? Different in every state. And then in order to prescribe it, you have to take a course, several hours. I took it very early on. Yeah, and then over the first year or two of medical cannabis adoption and prescribing in Utah, the state noticed that there were a lot of pop-up clinics that were doing cash pay evals, short visits, and it was, and they don't take insurance, so it was kind of potentially negatively impacting accessibility. So then they came out with this update saying you can prescribe a limited number without having to take that full course, kind of thing. Yeah. Just like you could register for Spravato without doing any kind of training program per se, but you agree to abide by this process of giving it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because they're going to be, I mean, based on what we see, I think, and the interest in the clinical trials we've announced just here at Novamind, there's a huge interest in people being part of these studies and having access to these medicines. And that demand is going to far outweigh the ability to train therapists. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on the system to provide medicines to people that, you know, want, and, you know, you could argue, like, have a right to try these medicines. And there just aren't going to be enough therapists that are going to be able to get MAPS training or through some of the other current programs to fill that need. And so is there just going to be a bottleneck and people are going to have a hard time getting access? Or is it going to be something like Reid's talking about, where that bar, you know, gets lowered more and more to provide access?
Like in Spravato, after a little while when it was on the market, Janssen, the sponsor, the drug company, came out and said, okay, for a subset of individuals, you might be able to do less than the full 2 hours if they've had this many doses and their heart rate, blood pressure hasn't changed in this way. Although practically speaking, that's been really tough, and it's even changed since then.
Right. Well, there's already an access problem now, right? All of our therapists here at every clinic I've ever worked at, frankly, have been booked out months. So the things we have on offer now are already in high demand. Imagine when the super sexy stuff like psychedelics gets approved.
We live in a community where there's just a shortage of therapists. You know, like you can't.
And prescribers, right? I mean, a lot of the medicines that are prescribed are for psychiatric illness are not prescribed by guys like you. They're not prescribed by psychiatrists. They're prescribed by mid-levels or family practice docs.
At least there's an enthusiasm and awareness in the community and among prescribers, therapists towards these medicines. Like when MDMA-assisted psychotherapy presumably gets approved, you'll have there will be that bottleneck, but you'll have people just wanting to offer it, and it's not like I don't think that will be the challenge. The perception is improving, the awareness. It'll just be all of the other logistics that are, of course, non-trivial.
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the same things we're already, again, working through with ketamine in our ketamine clinics, trying to find solutions to these problems of access and availability of prescribers or therapists. And there are different creative ways you can approach that problem of accessibility and scalability, right? But those aren't really being addressed in these current large-scale phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. That's more in the realm of companies like ours that are trying to really figure out this model of the future, right? How do you bring these medicines to large groups of people in a safe way, like in the future?
Effective way and accessible way. Yeah.
By the clinical work, by the pilot programs like our frontline ketamine-assisted psychotherapy group program that's testing out clinically a new model of delivering care, and then by investigator-initiated studies. Another way they get explored, either in parallel with the drug development, like MAPS has a program for that, USONA has a program, Compass is doing some, and then by everything that happens next, like we've been talking about, off-label use, pairing it with different things.
You also have places like Oregon, where you have the initiatives to, make, I think theirs was, it's like 106.
Measure 109.
109. Where psilocybin becomes legal for, I don't know what the actual language is, but it's like basically legal for medicinal use.
Yeah, mental health purposes.
But that's not the same as, that's irrespective of clinical trials, right? This is a state that has said, all right, we think that this stuff is safe enough for the public to use it, but here are the containers in which it will be legal to use it.
Like medical cannabis, but we're talking about psilocybin and therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to have some minimum training standards as well.
Yeah, that's being debated in those committee meetings that you can go look up online, the minutes, or even watch, or what are the minimum credentials needed.
Right.
Yeah. The same things that come up every time one of these medicines goes to the FDA for a new study is, do you need to have a PhD there? Is a master's okay? How about master's level prescribers?
Yeah. Yeah, and like you were saying, it seems to start really, really strict and then gets looser and looser over time, which makes sense.
Because in the end, the FDA and the DEA, at least it feels to us like we're all on the same team here. It's not the Nixon or the Reagan era anymore. And, there is this an overarching sentiment that, let's reduce suffering, but there's a lot of different opinions on how to go about it.
Right. Yeah, there sure are. So, Paul, with you here, we've talked a little bit about kind of the structure of clinical trials, some of the challenges of bringing this medicine to the people in a way that makes sense, that's helpful. I thought it might be interesting just for people who are interested in this kind of science. How do you do a placebo-controlled, blinded, like double-blind trial with psychedelics?
Good question.
Because that seems, for anybody who knows those terms, maybe you could define the terms I just used too, but like it's for people who know anything about psychedelics, that seems awfully challenging.
Yeah. Well, I think it is awfully challenging. I don't think anybody really has figured that out yet, like how to really do one, right? First of all, just starting with basics, right? Mm-hmm. So when you get to larger scale studies, especially if you're doing anything that is with the FDA in effort to bring a drug to market, at some point you have to do a controlled study, like usually placebo-controlled, where let's say you have a group of 50 people, half of them get the drug you're studying and half of them get something else, an inactive placebo or some kind of other ineffective drug.
So there's an inactive placebo and active placebos, right? Inactive being that you're not going to feel anything.
An inactive, like a sugar pill,
right.
Essentially.
So in ketamine studies, it's an active placebo that uses midazolam or Versed that gives some kind of experience. In psilocybin studies, it's an active placebo in that it's often niacin that gives a flushing reaction. And in MDMA studies, it's interesting. Now it's a sugar pill, inactive, but the initial studies were a low dose of MDMA, but then MAPS in the analysis and with their integrity as a value, they showed the FDA, that low dose is actually making people do worse than getting a sugar pill. And we think to have the most clean and fair and accurate representation, we should go back to the inactive, and they did.
Yeah. But the placebo, that's a key element of any clinical trial, like phase 2, 3 clinical trial. Keeping the person who's getting the medicine blinded. So that means they're not supposed to know whether they got the active drug or the placebo. That's another key feature. And many studies try to keep double blinding, which means the person, like the researchers, also don't know whether the person got the active drug or not. With psychedelics, obviously, there's like a lot of challenges to keeping people blinded, because if you take a psilocybin pill, or what might be a psilocybin pill, you can probably figure out pretty well within an hour or two whether you got the active drug or whether you got the placebo. Like, not all the time, but it's very challenging to keep the person blinded to that. Right. I mean, occasionally you hear stories about people that get a placebo and think they got the real thing, or vice versa. They get like the real thing and they don't feel anything. But those are they're rare. Like, that's not the typical experience.
I did hear a fun story about that of a guy who participated in a psychedelic clinical trial, and he got his medicine, had his experience, and was kind of an evangelist afterward. This was amazing. I had these visions, this transformative insight. And then at the end of in this study, they unblinded at the end of the study, meaning they let you know whether or not you got the drug or not. And he did not. He got the placebo.
Yeah.
So,
that's unusual, but it can happen. Placebo effect can be a very strong thing.
It's an important point. Placebo does not mean nothing.
No.
There are even very real neurotransmitter changes that go on when you're under the assumption that something is helping you. Like, the power of the human mind is amazing.
Yeah. Power of belief.
Yeah,
but this also becomes relevant in these clinical trials in the sense that most people that come into these studies are really hoping they get the real thing, right? They've often got a lot pinned on this being their chance to get some help, right, to relieve suffering, and half of them are not going to get the real drug, right?
Yeah.
They're going to get the placebo, and there's a huge disappointment that often goes along with that. And as you know, Steve, as being trained in this type of therapy, and maybe even having been in some sessions like this, that's a big part of the training and a big challenge if you're a facilitator or a therapist in a psychedelic clinical trial is
Right.
how do you handle those sessions where the person appears to have not gotten the active drug and you've got another 6 or 7 hours to sit in the
Yeah.
room with them.
Well, not only that, but
Yeah.
now we have another variable to measure, because like how much
The
does
disappointment.
this disappointment influence outcome?
Yeah.
Because if we're measuring, ideally, if you could splice and dice and account for all the variables, you'd be able to tell. Well, it seems like our placebo group did way worse than a weight group, control group, right? Why is that? Well, maybe we discovered that it's because they all got super pissed or disappointed that they detected they didn't get the study drug they were hoping for. And I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, if any of these clinical trials have measures to account for disappointment or I mean, there's a mystical experience questionnaire, things like that, but we don't know if we have any that account specifically for disappointment.
It's more than just a momentary blip of disappointment too. And it could go either way, like I think you're alluding to, is you could be so disappointed it negatively impacts outcomes, or you just spent, even if you're disappointed, you just spent 7 hours in therapy. And then, that could be helpful.
Or in a
Exactly.
personal private retreat for a day.
Yeah. And
There's different ways you can frame it.
Well, and now you have the variables like I was talking about earlier about the skill of the therapist. And having participated in some of these clinical trials, we do receive training about how to be in these situations so that we're not introducing too much. But, we're still with that person for 7 hours. And depending on how the therapists, the facilitators, the dosing session monitors are handling that situation, it could be the case that person has like a really transformative experience. And here you have somebody in the placebo group who actually does really, really well. And so it just makes the data really interesting to interpret at that point.
And that's hence the big sample sizes and controlling for everything you can and acknowledging the things that you can't. But I will say, like, having been doing clinical trials for over a decade and 200 and some odd in by now, the psychedelic trials are paying careful attention to these where the roles are separated. Like it used to be that I could do everything on a drug study. If we're talking about give a pill for depression, to many of those, I could do the ratings, I could do the assessments. In the psychedelic clinical trials, we're almost always seeing separation of roles, of facilitators, study physicians, and then there's the use of remote raters, which I think is a good move. I used to think it was a pain in the butt for sites because we'd have to schedule like a video chat or phone chat for someone to do their key assessment with someone in another state, a group that does it for everyone, and they're so trained. But it's, I think it's worth it. And that's how it looks for a lot of the studies we're doing in the psychedelic
and Reid,
space.
who's the principal investigator on most of our studies, essentially you're not allowed to do much of anything except for be the overseeing principal investigator and make those
tough work
and make those decisions about who, whether a person is included in the study or, if there's certain issues that need to be addressed. But you really have no clue as to who's gotten a placebo or gotten a medicine in any of these psychedelic studies.
They keep me extra blinded. Yeah.
Which, what were you going to move on to? Because I was going to circle back a little bit to how some of the other studies we do that avoid this problem, but they aren't clinical trials in the same way. They're the investigator-initiated trials that Reid brought up earlier.
You read my mind, Paul.
Did I?
That's
okay,
what
I sensed that
there was an energy there. I open my mouth, inhale, but Paul stole my breath. I will gladly give it to you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, the reason I bring it up is so there are, and Reid used the term investigator-initiated trials earlier, I think, which some people may not be familiar with. But basically it's referring to smaller studies or pilot studies is sometimes how they're called, where it's somebody like Reid or myself that has an idea and wants to do a study, and so we do it. We don't get funding from a pharmaceutical company. We pay for it in other ways. So they're usually small maybe 10, 20 people or a little more. And we designed the study ourselves. And in a study that's a pilot like this, you can just have a single arm. So you don't need to necessarily have a control group. And so everybody is guaranteed, right, to get the medicine. And these are meaningful studies. I mean, this is how a lot of the research started out that led us to where we're at now with MDMA or psilocybin or LSD or others. They started with these smaller investigator-initiated or pilot studies. And we're interested in this, and that's another part of what we're doing, here at Novamind is just a handful, but they can be ways of looking at other questions like what we were discussing earlier about, like, well, how can you find a model that maybe isn't so resource intensive, right?
Like groups
or shorter time, or one therapist instead of two.
Yeah, changing the ratio of the therapist. Like, you don't have any of that flexibility in a sponsored clinical trial. You just have to follow the protocol, and you really have no influence on it, right? You just kind of like follow the recipe. In an investigator-initiated trial, we get to write the protocol, right? So we have that control, and then we get to run the study. And the blinding and those kinds of things, the placebo control, aren't relevant at that phase of research. So
yeah, they're often called open label feasibility studies, like the eating disorder one at MAPS as an example. Like, the indication they're going for potential FDA approval, of course, is PTSD, but there are other studies that have been done and that are ongoing. And like the eating disorder one is an example where there's no placebo group.
So that's a way to get through this process a little bit more quickly and maybe add indications.
Preliminary data,
yeah. Yeah, you're not necessarily going to add, well, it could lead to adding an indication,
It could lead to it, right? We got some early support for the idea that maybe MDMA would help with eating disorder.
Ideas worth pursuing.
Yeah, or maybe we just learn like a lot of valuable information, and then depending on what happens in a few years when the drug is to market, maybe there's things we learn from these smaller studies that guide us in how we roll this out, in the real world later.
So how does this differ from compassionate use? Because you hear people talking about compassionate use.
Yeah, so that is an official program or route through the FDA where as prescribers, we can apply to get access for our patients of certain medicines before they're approved. But there's some caveats. So those are called compassionate use or expanded access, and there are different ways of approaching it. So with the MDMA example, MAPS has created a formal program with 10 sites and a very limited number at each site where you can go try to be one of those few people who get access if you have PTSD and it's outside of a clinical trial. With psilocybin, Canada's kind of further ahead through a group called Thayer, for example, giving a lot of compassionate use access. But there, in theory, you can apply to access the medicine for your clients, but you have to have a drug company sponsor, manufacturer who's willing. So like on USONA's website, they'll say, talk to us about expanded access or compassionate use on Compass. They'll be very upfront about, we don't allow that yet. And USONA's still working out what that might look like.
And MAPS, like you said, they do have this program as part of what they offer. I think they only got approved to provide expanded access for 50 people, I think.
10 sites.
So there's a handful of sites around the country where you don't have to be in a clinical trial to get access to MDMA, but it's a relatively small number of people.
Yeah. Right.
And you can do it for individuals, right? I thought about this when I was working up at the cancer hospital up at the Huntsman, like, is it worth going through this for such and such a person, right? Who seems like a great candidate. They're in need, they're really suffering, but it's challenging because, like Reid said, you have to have a partner that's a drug producer, and it's a lot of work. I mean, it's as much work to do like a single use, like compassionate use or expanded access application as it is to write like an investigator initiated trial and try to get that through. Right. It's
pretty time intensive.
Again, it's kind of back to the resource intensive nature of a lot of this work at this stage.
It's not unique to psychedelics either. It's been employed a lot in chemotherapies, for example, to give people access to drugs that are being studied, life-saving treatments. And of course, we can argue for that in our field where these can be life-saving treatments too. But it's new territory, and I think we will see, I'm hoping that we'll see more and more of that beyond what's just already been announced.
So speaking of what's been announced, I thought it might be fun just to kind of talk at a high level about the kinds of drugs that are on the menu here that different companies are trying to explore through clinical trials. We've got classic psychedelics. We've got drugs that some people would argue aren't psychedelics but have a consciousness-altering effect. We've got compounds that are novel, that haven't existed. We've got compounds that are psychedelic, but they don't produce the psychedelic effect, right? There's a group of companies that are trying to produce these medicines that might have similar mechanisms of action on the brain, but you don't have the same consciousness-altering effects. So there's lots of interesting work being done. But Reid, maybe you could tell us, we just, like we said, we got back from Chicago, which is a study on LSD and generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah, which we did an announcement of recently, and we've also announced our psilocybin work for depression. But what's coming in?
It's just fun timing because it's April. We're approaching April 19th, Bicycle Day. For those of you watching on YouTube, you may or may not have noticed Reid is wearing a celebratory T-shirt.
Okay, there it is.
Please be nice to me. I'm on acid. Reid is not actually on acid, but maybe for a future podcast episode.
Thanks for blowing my cover, Steve.
Just trying to protect you.
That's wise.
Okay, I've got your back. Yeah. But yeah, maybe you could talk about some of these medicines that are on the menu.
What a fun time to be doing this work. Like Paul and I talk about that a lot, and of course we podcast about it, Steve. Right. I never would have thought when I started my career that we'd be able to do this now. And sure, it's painstakingly slow and it's long overdue, but it is happening and the world is changing. And that felt like a historic event to go to that meeting because, it's been the dark ages for too long of these things. Like look at LSD for alcoholism, for example. There were 12 studies done before it was gone, and at least 1,000 subjects went through clinical trials. And the results were, we've talked about this before, like LSD for alcoholism beat treatment as usual. And if you compare it to the effect size, like a measure of how well a drug works, like summarized into a number, an effect size for alcoholism, there was a meta-analysis just done by some folks in Norway looking at these 12 studies. Effect size of 1 was really good. It's 2.5 times higher than treatment as usual with something like a camprosate that makes you just feel gross if you drink. So if you look at the estimated 100 million people who have died from alcoholism, in the looking to the past, if we can even tackle a fraction of that, that's huge, life-saving. Yet I know it's not being studied for alcoholism yet, but that may be one of the other indications that's explored, and certainly other addictions are coming through the various psychedelic pipelines. But yeah, it's a glorious time to be in mental health research, at least.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And even with the LSD study, I mean, MDMA has been in the works for a long time, and psilocybin, I don't know, it's a natural, it comes in a natural form. It doesn't have the charged history that LSD has, like culturally. And so to me, it feels like a huge milestone that an LSD study is getting approved by the FDA for at this scale, right? Like even though psilocybin is a little bit ahead of LSD, like it just seems like like Reid is saying, like the world is really changing. Mm-hmm. The fact that we're running LSD studies now that are federally approved, like, wow.
And coming down the pipeline, if you follow the psychedelic news, you see that some people are working on DMT, like IV DMT studies coming down the pipeline in some places, some countries, maybe to North America soon.
Somebody called Joe Rogan. Let him know. I'm sure he knows.
Yep. And ibogaine being explored for opiate addiction and analogs, like slightly modified forms of it. Along with a lot of other indications. There are psilocybin studies for eating disorders. There are MDMA studies for eating disorders. There was there have been a lot of investigator-initiated studies done that are just fascinating, like PTSD and the impact in couples that Ann Wagner and MAPS did. That was just really cool because you're giving MDMA not only to the individual with PTSD, like say a combat veteran, but their spouse, because of the well-known impact of having severe PTSD on the family. There's been some autism and MDMA studies, social anxiety, autism, and a lot more coming.
Yeah, and you'll probably see combinations, studies on combinations of psychedelics. Cannabis with ketamine, or
that'll take a little while, in my opinion, because just like the reason why we have to use synthetic psilocybin for now in psilocybin studies is because the FDA really requires that everything be controlled that you possibly can, including all the other fungi stuff and the alkaloids in a whole mushroom, for example. And combinations, while exciting, I think we got to get some things approved first.
Yeah. There are examples of combination pills, right, in psychiatry. I don't know how often they actually get used. I'm trying to remember the name of the one was Zyprexa and Prozac.
Symbiox.
Didn't catch on that much. But hey, if it was, you could foresee a future where there might be combination drugs like that.
And those were approved usually individually first. Although
right.
Not always. Like some of our clinical trials over there, non-psychedelics, do have a medicine that has two pieces to it because it's a mechanistic thing. Like if you were to study ayahuasca, for example, as an oral medicine for whatever, you would need the MAOI and the DMT, right?
Right. Well, gentlemen, anything else relevant to clinical trials that you think our audience might be interested in, or that you're just really excited to share?
I need a minute thing. It seems like we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. We tend to do
today,
that in this podcast, Paul.
Quickly.
We like to skim across the surface, dive deep every once in a while, bring up a pearl, share it with the world. Any other pearls?
No, I think we've covered them too. We've talked about the challenges with the bias, the placebo-controlled issues in psychedelic trials. We haven't really gone down the rabbit holes, the very important ones that we'll save for another day of, honoring the indigenous origins of these medicines and factoring those in, like how do these medicines do in those settings versus the way we've had to kind of maybe even water them down or adapt them for a westernized healthcare model. The need for diversity in clinical trials. So many other things we could touch on that I'll refrain from.
All right.
Yeah, that alone is a topic worthy of a podcast.
For sure.
Diversity and inclusion, I would say. Yeah, no, I think it's been a good overview.
Awesome.
Yeah,
well,
really
thanks, Dr. Thielking, for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. Please call me Paul.
The Intrepid.
Please.
The Intrepid, Paul Thielking.
Okay, the Intrepid, yeah.
I like it.
Haven't been called that before, I don't think.
At least not in a while, right?
Not in a while.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Gentlemen.
Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.